What if I told you that inside your grandmother's room, there might be something that was never supposed to be there? Something that doesn't belong to this world. Something trapped between the walls, waiting, watching, and worse. Maybe you've already felt its presence without realizing it. After all, how many times have you felt an unexplainable shiver? How many nights have you woken up with the feeling that someone was watching you? There are stories our grandparents never told us, secrets buried within old houses, things they made sure to hide to protect us. But some doors should never be opened, because certain presences never left. Grandma's room has always been a mystery, always closed, locked, untouched. No one enters, no one talks about it. But at night, if you pay attention, you might hear a whisper coming from there. A faint call, almost imperceptible, as if something or someone is waiting patiently, something that has never rested. One time, Daniel's cousin visited their grandmother's house and, out of curiosity, tried to open the door. The lock seemed jammed, but she swore she felt a slight movement on the other side, as if someone was trying to open it at the same time. Terrified, she never returned to that house. Since then, the family stopped talking about that room. There was also an old radio forgotten in the basement that would turn on by itself at exactly 3 in the morning. At first, everyone thought it was a defect, but Grandma never allowed them to get rid of it. "It belongs to the room," she would say, without further explanation. The scariest part was that, on the quietest nights, Daniel could swear he heard a muffled melody mixed with incomprehensible whispers coming from the radio. If you've made it this far, you need to leave a sign in the comments. Write, "I hear the whispers," and maybe you'll be safe. But first, make a decision. Will you keep watching, or will you leave now while you still can? Because some stories should never be heard until the end. Like this video and subscribe now, or it might be too late. In the first few days at his grandmother's house, Daniel tried to ignore the strange noises coming from the room. He told himself they were just echoes of the old house, maybe the wind sneaking through the cracks of the aged wooden walls. But as the nights passed, the sounds became clearer. It was no longer just a distant rustling. It was whispers, low, constant, as if someone was speaking right there, on the other side of the door. On the third night, Daniel lay down to sleep, trying to push away thoughts of that room. But around 3 in the morning, he was awakened by a different sound. Footsteps. Slowly, they echoed through the hallway. He held his breath, hoping it was just his grandmother going to the bathroom. But then he realized the footsteps weren't coming from the hallway. They were inside the locked room. Fear began to take hold of him. He got out of bed and walked toward his grandmother's door. He pressed his ear against the wood and felt a chill run down his spine as he heard a muffled murmur. "Let me out," the voice whispered from the other side. He stepped back, his heart pounding in his chest. It couldn't be his grandmother. She was asleep in the room next door. He ran back to his bed, pulled the blankets over himself, and tried to convince himself he had imagined it all. But the fear had already settled in. Something was inside that room, something that wasn't supposed to be there. The next day, Daniel decided to ask his grandmother about the noises. He found her sitting in the kitchen, drinking her usual tea. "Grandma, have you ever heard anything strange coming from your room at night?" he asked, trying to sound casual. The woman stopped stirring her tea and fell silent for a moment before replying, "It's better not to talk about it, dear. Just promise me that you will never, ever open that door." Daniel tried to insist, but his grandmother simply got up and left the kitchen, abruptly ending the conversation. His heart pounded. If even she avoided talking about it, then something far worse than he imagined was hiding behind that door. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. Fear had taken root in his mind, and curiosity was battling against the growing terror inside him. He tossed and turned in bed for hours, until, In a moment of either bravery or insanity, he decided he needed to see with his own eyes what was inside that room. Slowly, he got up, each step creaking on the old wooden floor. The hallway was dark, lit only by a faint glow coming from the gap under his grandmother's door. He walked toward it, holding his breath. The silence was absolute, until the door creaked slightly, opening a small gap on its own. Daniel felt his body freeze. Inside the room, there was a shadow. Not just any shadow. Something was moving in the darkness. He blinked, and in an instant, the door slammed shut violently, as if something had noticed Olk. He ran back to his room, locking the door behind him. His heart pounded erratically, and the only thought in his mind was, "I saw something in there." But what? The next day, he tried to act normal, but every time he walked down the hallway, he felt a chill run down his spine. The door remained closed, unchanged, but something had shifted. Something now knew he was there, and that he had seen it. That morning, Daniel gathered his courage and spoke to his grandmother again. He needed to know what was inside that room. But her response was even more disturbing. "Daniel, you shouldn't have tried to look. Now it knows you're here," she said in a hushed voice. "If you hear something, pretend you didn't. If something calls your name, never answer. And never look through the keyhole." His grandmother's words unsettled Daniel even more. Who was it? What would happen if he looked through the keyhole? He felt a chill upon realizing that his grandmother was genuinely scared, and that was a bad sign. That night, he couldn't sleep. Every sound seemed louder, every shadow darker, and at 3 a.m, he heard something call his name. Daniel spent the next day consumed by doubt and fear. He couldn't ignore his grandmother's warnings, but something inside him screamed for answers. What was in that room? Who was it? Why was his grandmother so terrified? He knew that if he wanted to understand, he would have to find clues on his own. Searching the house, he found a wooden box at the back of his grandmother's closet. Inside were old black and white photographs, yellowed letters, and a diary with pages worn by time. The photos showed his grandmother when she was young, standing beside an unfamiliar man, a thin young man with deep, melancholic eyes. In every picture he looked out of place, as if he didn't belong there. With trembling hands, Daniel opened the diary and began to read. The old, shaky handwriting detailed strange occurrences, sleepless nights, unexplainable noises, doors closing on their own. But what caught his attention the most was the last entry. "He is still here, trapped. He calls me every night, begs to be freed, but I know the truth. I know what happens if the door is opened, the evil it will bring. I can't allow it. I can't let him out, even if it means carrying this guilt forever." Daniel felt a shiver run down his spine. This was a warning. His grandmother knew exactly what was happening. But who was he? And what would happen if the door was opened? That night, Daniel tried to sleep, but his mind was restless. His grandmother's diary had revealed something terrible, a secret she had been trying to hide for years. When he finally drifted off, a nightmare consumed him. He was in the hallway, standing before the door to the room. A slow, dragging voice called his name, pleading. He tried to run, but his feet were stuck to the ground. The door began to open on its own, creaking slowly. He woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. But the worst part was still to come. The door to his grandmother's room, which should have been closed, was now slightly ajar. Daniel sat up in bed, trying to catch his breath. The silence in the house felt heavier than ever. He fixed his gaze on the half-open door of his grandmother's room, waiting for it to close on its own. But nothing happened. The air around him felt cold, sharp. Something was different. He wanted to ignore it, to convince himself it was just his imagination. But then, the sound came. A slow scratch against the wood. 3 scratches. A pause. Then 3 more. Daniel felt his spine turn to ice. It was like something was trying to get out. His first instinct was to run to his grandmother's room, but he forced himself to stop. He needed to see. He needed to understand. With hesitant steps, he approached the door and placed his hand on the doorknob. It was ice cold. He took a deep breath and with a push fully opened the door. The room was dark, but something felt off. The air was heavy, charged. The curtains swayed slightly, even though there was no wind. The only light came from the hallway, casting distorted shadows on the walls. Daniel stepped inside, feeling the floor creak beneath his feet. That's when he heard it. Daniel. The voice didn't come from a specific place. It seemed to echo throughout the entire room, as if it were being whispered from every dark corner. He froze. The name was whispered again, this time closer. Daniel. His heart pounded violently. He looked around, but no one was there. And yet, in the darkest corner of the room, a reflection caught his attention. He squinted to see better. There was something there, or rather someone. A tall, gaunt figure emerged from the shadows. Its face was hidden in the darkness, but Daniel could feel the oppressive presence it radiated. The voice whispered again, this time with a tone of urgency. "Help me." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He tried to step back, but he felt something grabbing his ankle. He looked down and saw pale fingers emerging from the wooden floor, gripping his leg tightly. He struggled to break free, but the more he fought, the more the fingers seemed to pull him downward. Then the voice changed. The pleading tone vanished, replaced by something dark, deep, and cruel. "Now you are trapped here too." A chilling shiver ran down Daniel's spine. He yanked his leg forcefully, trying to free himself from the fingers emerging from the floor, but they held him with an unnatural grip. Desperation took over, and in a final act of panic, he threw himself backward, crashing onto the cold floor. The fingers disappeared in an instant, as if they had never been there. Panting, he crawled backward until his back hit the opposite wall. His eyes remained locked on the tall, gaunt figure still standing in the dark corner of the room. The voice echoed once more, even lower and more sinister this time. "You need to see. You need to know." The darkness around him seemed to shift. Daniel felt the room shrinking, the thinning air making it harder to breathe. His heart pounded against his chest, and he tried to call for his grandmother, but his voice wouldn't come out. Something invisible seemed to be gripping his throat, preventing any sound from escaping. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed through the room. The old wardrobe in the far corner creaked open on its own, revealing an interior lined with dusty mirrors. Daniel forced himself to look at them, and then he saw. In the reflection, it wasn't just his own pale, terrified face staring back. Behind him, the shadowy figure revealed itself completely. It was a man, cadaverous in appearance, his skin a sickly gray, his eyes completely black. He wore old, tattered clothing, as if he belonged to another time. But the worst part was his smile, a wide, distorted grin that should not have been human. "You need to know. The truth was buried," the figure whispered, its mouth moving inside the mirror, while its image in the room remained completely still. "She lied to you. She always lied. And now, you belong to this place." The room started spinning around Daniel. The mirror shattered into 1,000 pieces, and a piercing scream filled the air. He covered his ears, feeling an unbearable pressure building inside his head. The voices multiplied, whispering words he couldn't understand. Then, silence fell. Daniel opened his eyes and realized he was no longer there. The room had changed. The walls were peeling, the floor covered in dust and soot. The air reeked of rot and dampness. The room was no longer the same. He tried to run to the door, but the doorway was now sealed with old wooden planks and rusted nails. It was as if time had reversed, as if he had been transported to a past that did not belong to him. A cold shiver ran down his neck as he felt warm breath behind him. He didn't need to turn around to know who was there. "Now you know," the voice murmured with cruel satisfaction. "Now you understand why no one can leave." Daniel tried to force the door open, but it wouldn't budge. His heart pounded so violently it felt like it would burst. Behind him, the shadowy presence moved, inching closer. "You need to remember. You need to see." The voice echoed, carrying a mixture of anguish and malice. The wooden floor beneath his feet groaned as if it were alive. Daniel felt a cold dread rise up his spine as he realized the floor was sinking slightly. It was as if he were standing on something that was breathing. The room around him began to change. The walls were now covered in dark stains, dripping with something thick and viscous. The voice called to him again, this time closer. "Look at the floor," it commanded. Daniel hesitated but finally lowered his gaze, and the blood drained from his face. On the wooden floor, there were marks, handprints pressed into the planks, as if someone had been dragged into them. The stains were deep, engraved like scars from the past. Daniel's mind began to spiral, disjointed memories surfacing like fragments of a forgotten nightmare. He saw flashes of a child crying, hands reaching for the light before being pulled into the darkness. He felt the pain of someone who had been left behind. Then the truth struck him like a crushing blow. His grandmother didn't just know about what was locked in that room. She was the reason it was there. Years ago, a boy had been trapped inside, forgotten, erased from the family's history. His spirit, now twisted by hatred and sorrow, was the entity that haunted the room. Daniel fell to his knees, the voices whispering incessantly, "She forgot me. She forgot us. Now you see. Now you belong to us." The room seemed to close in around him, the shadows expanding as if they were about to devour him. He tried to resist, tried to fight against the darkness, but his body was no longer his own. The past had claimed him. The room twisted around Daniel. The shadows swallowed every corner, and the whispers grew louder, filling his ears with incomprehensible words. He tried to move, but his feet felt glued to the floor, as if the wood were absorbing his existence. "Now you are part of us," the voice whispered in his ear. A cruel shiver ran down his spine. His body refused to respond. His eyes widened as something invisible touched his shoulder. Then Daniel saw. In the distorted reflection of the dusty window, he realized that his image was no longer the same. His face was pale, his eyes dark and hollow, just like the entity that had once pursued him. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. He tried to break free, but his strength had vanished. A sound echoed through the room, a low, rasping laugh, as if multiple voices were merging into one. Daniel realized then that the entity hadn't just wanted to scare him. It wanted something much worse. It wanted to take his place. The hallway light flickered one last time before going out completely. And then everything fell silent. Daniel felt time dissolving around him. The darkness was no longer just an environment. It was alive, consuming his consciousness. His mind fragmented, his memories vanished like smoke in the wind. He tried to fight, but he no longer remembered who he was. Voices began to echo again, but this time he could understand them. They told stories of others who had been taken. Children, men, women, all erased from existence, all condemned to that room forever. And then he saw. In the reflection of the darkened window, he was no longer Daniel. His face was pale, his eyes hollow and dark, just like the entity that had hunted him. He no longer belonged to the world of the living. Now, he was part of the house, part of its hidden history. The next morning, his grandmother entered the room and found everything exactly as it had been before. No sign of Daniel, no trace that anyone had ever been there. But that night, when everything fell silent, a faint whisper filled the air. "Now it's your turn.